So I'm a Métis woman, and my mother's from the community of Fort Chipewyan in northern Alberta, and my grandmother is from there, and my great-grandmother is also from there. So I come from, on my mother's side, fur trading families who lived in the Northwest Territories and northern Alberta. And I have Gwich'in and Dene ancestry, as well as Cree and Métis. I have some ancestors who lived in the river lots at Red River and were forced to move after the real story, the attack by the federal government on that Métis land. And I live in Cowichan Bay, and I have 3 children. And I'm also involved with an organization called the Center for Response-Based Practice, which is committed to helping people recover from violence in a spirit of dignity and safety, as well as social justice. So I work a lot with Dr. Alan Wade and Dr. Linda Coates, and so we're developing response-based ideas and taking this work out internationally as well as locally, and this work has really been informed in conjunction with community work, doing a lot of work with Kaska folks in the Yukon and different First Nations and Métis communities here on Vancouver Island. So when I say Indigenous resistance and response-based practice, I think what I'm really talking about is the importance of eliciting conversations of resistance in therapeutic conversations, so that we're not just talking with people about stories of pain. Because over the years I've noticed, and have colleagues that have joined me in this through research and counseling practice, that it can be re-traumatizing to tell your story of pain over and over again. And that's typically the story that counselors and social workers are interested in. So alongside that story of pain and violence and harm that's been done to us is another story, which I would call the story of resistance. And this is the story of how we kept our spirit alive during really difficult times. It's the story of our acumen, our intellect, our spirit, and all the ways that we've responded to mistreatment. So from a counseling perspective, I'm more interested in the interaction between people and what happens in the space between us, and what happens in the social world with people, than what is going on in the individual mind or psychology of the person. And I think when people have been hurt, they've been victims of violence, there's a political problem with tracking the source of the unwellness into the mind of the person. And yet that's what we do all the time. The interest of response-based practice is to look at issues of violence, recovery, wellness, repair in a social context, and not just with the individual. Every Indigenous person in Canada has the right to live in dignity, to have access to security, clean water, clean food, services, resources, the same as other Canadians, and these are all matters of human dignity. Of course, the fact that we don't is a problem of social injustice. So one of the things that I draw from a colleague, Vicki Reynolds, who is involved in counseling and social work. She says that we're all in a dirty bathtub together. None of this work is clean. We're all mopping up from social injustice. But if we do individual psychology and counseling with one person in a room, and we don't challenge the social structures and systems that replicate dominance, we're never going to make a change. About 35 years ago, there was a whole bunch of new theories that came out that talked about how women who had been harmed by violence had all these things wrong with them to begin with, which actually attracted the violence. So there are lots of victim-blaming theories. And I think that it's very undignified to apply these theories to human beings, to women, to Indigenous people, to people recovering from violence. So another tenet of response-based practice is to challenge and contest the blaming of victims. Alan Wade and Linda Coates developed, or created what they call the 4 operations of language, which is a tool of analysis. So whenever you're reading professional documents, psychological reports, media, textbooks, you can find these 4 operations, and they always exist together. And they are, when someone's writing or talking about violence, mechanisms that hide or minimize the violence. So often you'll see that violence has been done, but there's no perpetrator. We don't know who did it, right? So the second mechanism is that we conceal the victim's resistance. So if we don't talk about how the person resisted the violence, and I don't mean just fighting back physically, but resistance has lots of subtle forms that it can take, and I'll talk about that in a minute. If we don't talk about how people resisted the violence, then we cast them as passive, for one thing. And then when we cast women or Indigenous people as passive, it really invites in the flood of racist discourse, like, why don't those people do anything for themselves? She really brought it on herself. Why don't they just do this or that? And another reason it's so important to elicit stories of resistance is that it really sheds light on the true brutality of the violence. There are a lot of perpetrator strategies at work, whether it's an individual person who's being violent or the federal government. They anticipate that people will resist violence, and so they put in strategies in advance to suppress resistance. And one of them we know is isolation. Right? One of them is removing people from their loved ones, their friends, their children, their community, so they're more vulnerable. So we talk about, that's the second operation. So eliciting violence. The third operation of language is that you see the perpetrator is excused, or the violence of the perpetrator is minimized. And the fourth one is that it's transferred onto the victim, so the victim is blamed for the violence. One of the ways that I conceptualize responses to violence, and resistance is one response, but one response among many, is through a medicine wheel of responses. So I look at how a person has responded emotionally, intellectually, spiritually, and physically. So a physical response to violence could be that the person ran away, or they, in the aftermath, developed pain in their body, bruising, or they became sick, those kinds of things. It could also be they moved their arm to hit somebody or to block a punch, that kind of thing. Those are all physical type responses. And of course these all overlap with each other. They're not separate categories really. An emotional response could be sadness, despair, longing for a better world, missing the loved ones that they're separated from, that kind of thing. And so much of what's called an effect or an impact in psychology are actually human responses, and I think it's really important to distinguish, and I might be able to get back to that. So intellectual responses to violence, both during the event and afterwards, include planning for safety, imagining how I'm going to get away, how I'm going to get out of the room, what am I going to do afterwards, who will I tell, everything that we plan and think about, or in the moment we may make certain decisions, or we might scan the perpetrator to get details of what they look like. These are all intellectual kinds of responses. Spiritual, for me, it's where do we get our source of strength during really difficult times? So that could be, lots of people think of their grandmother, or they pray, they invoke the ancestors, they might visualize a positive outcome to the situation, that kind of thing. So our work is to help people recover from violence, to really attend to their spirit of dignity, of activity, of agency, of all the ways that they manage to stay alive and preserve their dignity, but also to care for other people. And this is a huge part that's missing out of child welfare interviewing, is when women are being harmed, there are many things they do in the moment to keep other people safe and to keep children safe. And when we don't talk about their resistance and their responses, we miss all that. We miss a whole half of a risk assessment, and we cast the woman as passive, someone who hasn't done enough for herself, and we remove her children. So these are huge problems. So we're trying to influence change in areas of child welfare, court systems, legal processes, counseling, therapy, anywhere where people have to talk about how they've been harmed, and other people are documenting that or writing reports about that or diagnosing that. And I think under a human rights kind of framework, we really have to start holding perpetrators and offenders responsible for violence while contesting the blaming of the victims. And I think until that happens, we really won't have social justice in this country, and women won't feel safe, phoning the police or going to court or going through the systems because they know that they'll be blamed. So we have a rich history of Indigenous resistance against colonialism in this country. You won't hear any of that in Harper's apology. It's very deliberate that we don't mention it. So that's part of our work and research, is to bring that to the forefront, stories of resistance, responses, and to look at the interaction, not just a one-sided thing, not what's going on in your brain, but what are the things that have been happening? What have people been doing to you? And when you've been telling other people, how have you been treated? How have you been treated by professionals? Has there been any kind of justice that can really help promote recovery?